Good morning, everyone. I'm Kelly Walsh, Membership Services Director for the Indiana Motor Truck Association. Thank you for joining us today on the Indiana Motor Truck Association's Safety and Maintenance Council online educational session. This is the first use of our new platform today, so I would appreciate any feedback from our participants on how you thought it worked and if you have any suggestions for future topics. A reminder of some events coming up before we begin our session today. Next week, the 16th, we have a scale visit at the Seymour Scale House, recently opened since construction on I-65 northbound was completed. There are 8 spots remaining for that session. Masks are required, and it is limited to 20 so that social distancing can be engaged. Next week is also Truck Driver Appreciation Week. Watch the TTW for an exciting announcement and a special event Monday morning. If you would like to pose a question today to our presenter, those will be addressed at the end of the session. To submit a question, on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, you see a chat option. In the to box, hit the drop-down menu and select Brittany Wooten. Brittany is with EROAD and will be monitoring the questions that are being submitted to be addressed again at the end of our session today. If you haven't already, please shut off your camera and mute your system. And at this time, I would like to introduce today's speaker. Soona Lee is the Director of Regulatory Compliance with EROAD. As the Director, Soona is responsible for understanding policy, context, and technical requirements and translating them for development of EROAD's suite of compliance products. She works closely with carriers, drivers, and the enforcement community to improve industry outcomes, compliance, safety, and efficiency through implementation of technology. Soona was named to the 2019 Lead ATA program by the American Trucking Associations and serves on multiple industry committees through ATA and CVSA. Again, a reminder, if you're participating in the webinar today, please make sure that your sound is muted to keep background noise at a minimum. Thank you, and Soona, the webinar is yours.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar today. We'll be talking about the hours of service changes that was recently published by FMCSA. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to add those in the chat box, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So to kick off, what we'll be covering today, we're going over the background on the rulemaking of the hours of service changes, what led to that, and what are the key change areas. We'll be going over each of the areas that were outlined in that final rule, and then we'll be going over some of the tips on implementation of that for your operations with your drivers and also with your back office staff, what you can do to make that a seamless process. And before we end with the Q&A, would like to touch on the proposed split duty pilot program that came out very recently by FMCSA to address one of the areas that was in the notice of proposed rulemaking, but was not included in the final rule, and what they're proposing to do and how you can look to participate, but also look at what their thinking is and how you can provide comments to help guide FMCSA on this pilot program. So without further ado, let's kick off into the hours of service final rule. The purpose of this final rule was to provide drivers and carriers with greater flexibility while also maintaining safety. Now, in terms of the rulemaking process, I personally will have to say FMCSA has, done a fabulous job of collaborating with everybody in the industry. They've held multiple sessions, public meetings with a lot of the industry folks to make sure that the voices of the drivers and the carriers are heard throughout this process. They engaged on the advance notice of proposed rulemaking in 2018 and led to a notice of proposed rulemaking in 2019. So it took about 2 years to get to where we are today. And that is actually, from a rulemaking standpoint, a fairly quick process to get to a final rule. It's considered to be a huge win for everybody. If you're operating under the current rules right now, then you are still going to be within compliance with the final rule. It actually provides further flexibility. So if you want to stay within the current rules, then you're not going to be penalized or impacted per se. But if you want to take advantage of these rules, then you can do so. So in terms of that final rule, it was published in June of this year. It is scheduled to take effect on September 29th. We're about 18 days out from that date. There are 4 key areas that there will be changes to. And one of the proposals that was in the notice of proposed rulemaking was not adopted, but it is part of that pilot program that we will discuss near the end of this presentation. So what are the 4 key areas that FMCSA proposed changes to? First is with the short haul exemption. Second is the adverse driving conditions exception. Third is the 30-minute rest break. And finally, it's the split sleeper berth. So to go into each of those areas in more detail, first, let's kick off with the short haul exemption. What has changed with the short haul exemption? First of all, current rule says it's 100 air mile radius from the starting location for the driver. That can be interstate, so it can cross over state lines, but the driver must remain within that 100 air mile radius. That changes and extends to 150 air mile radius with this new rule. Also, a driver today that is operating under the short haul exemption must finish their duty within 12 hours. And now with the final rule, it extends that up to 14 hours. So it gives the driver a longer duration as well as the distance from their starting point. What does not change with this short haul exemption? The driver that operates under the short haul exemption is currently and also going forward not required to keep any logbook requirement. So the record of duty status is not required. And that also extends to the use of an electronic logging device. So if a driver stays within the short haul criteria, then they do not have to keep rods or an ELD unless the driver is not able to meet the short haul criteria for more than 8 days in any rolling 30-day period. They're not required to take a 30-minute break during the duration of their duty period. However, they must start and end their shift from the same starting location. So that is at the terminal that they start, that they should return back to. In terms of the different types of operations, whether it's a passenger carrying or property carrying, they're not allowed to exceed the driving limit. For passenger, it's 10, and for property carrying, it's 11 hours. And they must do that within that new duty period limit. For property, that's 14 hours. And for passenger, that's 15. The driver must take at least 8 for passenger and 10 for property carrying drivers off duty between shifts. And that must be consecutive. It cannot be split. And finally, a carrier must keep time records that include the start and end times, as well as the total hours of on duty per day. So that's the time card requirement for a short haul driver. And those do not change with the final rule. So in terms of the short haul exception and ELDs, one of the areas that we wanted to cover off is that with the final rule, again, a short short haul driver does not need to keep rods or an ELD. However, FMCSA allows a carrier to voluntarily decide if they want to stick to using an ELD. And so EROAD, we actually conducted a survey with the carriers and the industry during the notice of proposed rulemaking process to see what the customers as well as the industry thought about this particular area. And so in terms of the survey results, we asked the question, would you, as the carrier and driver, continue to choose to use an ELD if the short haul criteria are broadened as proposed? So if by extending the 100 to 150 and extending the 12 to 14, would you consider still using the ELD? The results were quite interesting. About 40% of carriers and drivers said yes, they would continue using it. And 38% said no, they would not continue using it, and 22% were at that point still not sure. And in terms of the folks that said yes, they would continue using it, the reasons were quite interesting. In terms of the main reasons, to summarize, many fleets that are mixed in nature. So there are some drivers in the fleet that do long haul, as well as some drivers doing short haul. The carrier thought that there was value in having a consistent process between all drivers. So having drivers that are short haul also using ELDs, and now enables the fleet to have consistency in terms of record keeping, but also training processes across the board. That was mentioned as one of the key reasons. Another is to keep all the hours for all drivers in one place, keeping everything electronic rather than shuffling paper if one of the drivers, the short haul drivers, goes in outside of the criteria. Tracking mileage for IFTA taxes. This was the key reason that a lot of the larger fleets explained was the reason for having ELDs, as many of the ELDs also provide the IFTA functionality as well. In terms of keeping vehicle mileage in terms of this electronic system. And also keeping track of safety requirements. So data around the vehicle and also the driving behavior. So speeding, idling, and whether a driver is, conducting any harsh braking or harsh acceleration. Those impact how a driver is driving out on the road, and it enables coaching opportunities for a carrier and building safety programs. So those are enabled by an ELD that is not really allowed or possible by keeping paper time cards. So those are kind of the main reasons that a carrier may decide to work with the driver to implement an ELD in the fleet, in a short haul fleet. So with the short haul exception, what would the ELD actually provide drivers? Now, this is just how EROAD ELD does it, but there are other ELD providers that may operate and provide these types of features. So it's worth understanding what it can do. So with the EROAD ELD in particular, it can help drivers with the compliance. So some of the systems like EROAD have built in that air mile radius piece. So from the starting point for the driver, it will continuously measure 150 air mile, and it will be able to prompt the driver how they're tracking against that 150 air miles. Now, if they do exceed that, then they will be prompted to say, hey, you may have exceeded your short haul criteria, and we'll default you back to the interstate property carrying rules or any other baseline rule set that the driver was operating under. As well as the shift limit as well, the driver will be reminded of how many hours within the 14 that they will have left in terms of drive, as well as keeping track of that 11-hour drive limit as well, if you're a property carrying driver, how they're tracking against that drive time. For the back office, what can an ELD do for a carrier in terms of, does it actually capture an electronic time card automatically? Yes, it can. Certain systems like EROAD is able to capture electronic time cards and generate that in terms of each driver that works under the short haul so that you can have this when you are going through an audit, or you want to conduct any internal audits around your drivers to see if they meet all of those criteria. Another tool that is available is something called a short haul export or a short haul report that shows if there are any drivers that have exceeded one of the criteria, whether it be the air mile radius that got exceeded or the drive limit or the shift limit. If they did exceed it on a particular day, that can show up as kind of an exceptions report. So you're managing by exceptions per driver. And this report can help alongside the time card, and also the fact that an ELD already captures a lot of the rods for the driver, and you will always have that in case the driver does exceed the limits. So those are some of the interesting things that an ELD can help with. Again, it's a voluntary requirement in terms of whether you would choose to use an ELD even for a short haul fleet or not. Turning over to adverse driving conditions, which is one of the other changes that the final rule contained. Currently, with the adverse driving conditions, it allows the carrier to make the decision whether an adverse driving conditions can be applied or not. So at the time of dispatch, whether there was an adverse driving conditions that was anticipated or seen, reasonably expected. And those conditions are, snow, sleet, fog, or any other weather conditions that impact a driver's journey. Now, with the new rule, the definition kind of adapts and changes to allow not only the carrier, but also the driver to make the determination whether there is adverse driving conditions and apply this exception. So it changes to whether it was known or not reasonably known to a driver at the time, immediately before beginning their duty day, or immediately before beginning driving after a qualifying rest period. So after they do a split sleeper berth, or if they are starting their day, or after they take a rest, a 30-minute rest break, whether there is a condition that they did not know at the time that they're now facing that falls within the definition of adverse driving condition, then they can apply it, just as well as the motor carrier immediately before dispatching that driver to the next location. So that gives a little bit more flexibility, not only to the carrier, but also to the driver. And a point of note to call out here is that, again, it's up to the motor carrier to decide if they would like to have the driver have this ability to make the decision. It can be under company policy that they must always check with the carrier, or that, if the driver makes a determination, there are certain conditions that they can apply it under. So again, it gives a little bit more flexibility rather than prohibits any particular person from making this call. So when an adverse driving conditions is applied, currently under the current rules, it means that the 11-hour driving limit for a property carrying driver extends up to 2 hours, and same with the passenger, 10 hours increases to 12. But they must finish that within the existing shift or driving window, which means that the property carrying driver must finish that drive within 14 hours. So 13 hours, they must finish within 14. And for the passenger carriers, they must finish it within 15 hours. So it doesn't give too much flexibility there. They may still exceed the 14 and cause a violation. Whereas with the new changes, it extends not only the driving limit to 2 hours, but it also increases the shift window by 2 hours as well. So for the property carrying driver, it means they get 13 hours of total driving within 16-hour shift window. For the passenger carrier, it means 12-hour total driving within 17-hour shift window. So again, just touching back on the fact that a carrier still has the ability to set their own limits under the company policy. Certain carriers may not even enable a driver to use and apply adverse driving conditions for various different reasons. They may not want a driver to have a long shift or a long drive. So in that type of scenario, certain systems that may allow you to have that type of limitation. In terms of the EROAD ELD, there is an ability to set the exemptions and exceptions on the back-end side. So for each of the drivers, you may enable the adverse driving conditions exception, or you may disable that. And what that means is if it is not enabled, then the driver will not see that exception available to them on the ELD. If it does get enabled, this is what the driver will see in terms of the ELD counters. They will see that the drive limit extends to 13 and as of September 29th. The shift will extend to 16 hours right there. So another tip for using ELDs with adverse driving conditions is that a driver must annotate and include as much detail about the adverse driving conditions as possible. This will really help the driver when they encounter, roadside inspections and have to explain that to an inspector. But also, it will keep, the records pretty tidy when they're whenever it's subject to any audits or a review. So the more detail that can be added through annotation on a driver's log will help. It's fairly easy to do. The driver will just add that to the driving event that they were facing that led to an adverse driving condition. For example, if there was an accident on a bridge that they were having to cross over, they did not know about that ahead of time, and they just encountered it when they chose that route. That is possible through the annotation function. Turning over to the 30-minute rest break requirement. Currently, a property carrying driver is required to take a 30-minute rest break after 8 hours of on-duty time. So, for example, if a driver starts their day doing a pre-trip, that pre-trip time triggers that 8 hours before a 30-minute rest break is due. Now, in terms of the current rule, the duty statuses that allow a driver to take that 30-minute rest break are the off-duty status, sleeper berth, or off-duty PC, or any combination of this that makes up 30 minutes. Within the new rule, with the new rule and the changes, there's a lot more flexibility there. So with the 30-minute rest break, it's only required after driving for a total of 8 hours without a 30-minute break. So drive time does not need to be consecutive. So for example, in that scenario that I just explained with the before, if a driver starts their day with a pre-trip for 15 minutes, let's say, that does not trigger the start of the 8 hours. It's only started after the first driving event. And also, if there is a driving event and that stopped and there's like another 15 minutes of on-duty time, that 15 minutes is not included in the 8 hours before a 30-minute break is due. And so let's say a driver does driving for 4 hours, and then they come to a stop to do an on-duty, work somewhere. They're actually loading, and loading takes only 15, 20 minutes, which is really quick. But if they do, that 20 minutes does not count towards the 8 hours before a 30-minute break is required. And in terms of 30-minute rest break, FMCSA with the final rule actually permits a lot more flexibility here. So a driver actually can take that 30-minute rest break using on-duty, not driving status, just as much as off-duty or sleeper berth. So there's a lot more flexibility around how to take the 30-minute rest break. And a lot of drivers indicated that throughout their day, there are times when they're actually on duty for more than 30 minutes that already break up the driving. So for example, if they're fueling, if they're actually doing, if they're waiting at a loading dock, if they're actually, loading and unloading, that takes longer than 30 minutes, that would satisfy this 30-minute rest break, and it will reset that 8 hours before a 30-minute rest break is due. So I think this can provide a driver a lot more flexibility throughout the day as they go about their shift. So a 30-minute rest break examples. Here is one example that demonstrates the current versus the new rules. So here, currently on-duty time counts towards the 8 hours until a break is due. So in this example, at 10 a.m., after a 10 hours rest, a driver does 1 hour of on-duty, which starts the 8-hour clock. And so, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. At 6 a.m., there is a 30-minute rest break violation because the driver has not taken any 30-minute in sleeper berth or off-duty status. However, with the new rule, it means with the new rule, where does the 8-hour counter begin? It actually starts at 11 a.m. with the first driving event. So the 5 hours of driving that goes from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. is counted towards the 8. And then that 2 hours of on-duty time actually qualifies as a 30-minute rest break. And as a result, it resets at 6 p.m., the 8-hour counter again. So then the driver does 4 hours, and then they take another 1 hour on duty. That 1 hour on duty counts towards the 30-minute rest break. So this driver's logs here, he has 2 opportunities where he's actually taken a 30-minute rest break. So looking at day 2 example here, under the current rules, the driver again starts their 8 hours of 8-hour counter before the 30-minute rest break at 10 a.m. And he or she is required to take a rest break at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 at 6 o'clock, similar to the last time. However, in terms of this example, when the new rules, the 1 hour and the 3 hours and the 2 hours, as well as the 0.5 and 1 hour, which have that tick mark on top, they all qualify for that 30-minute rest break. And so in this case, the driver actually will continue to reset that 8 hours as they go along throughout the day. So there should be less 30-minute rest break violations with the new rules if a driver has this type of operation where they're actually driving and on duty throughout their day. Turning over to the more complicated situation with the split sleeper berth provision. Under the current rules, the driver is allowed to split their 10 hours off duty by doing 2 periods of sleeper berth or off-duty rest. One of the periods, the short off-duty period, which can also be in the sleeper berth, must be at least 2 hours long, and then the longer period must be in the sleeper berth for at least 8 hours. So it must be an 8 and 2 or more. Now, both of these periods, when they are satisfied, allow only the long sleeper period of 8 hours or more to be excluded from the 14-hour shift window. So the 2 hours or more is actually counted towards the 14-hour shift. And that actually impacts the driver's hours remaining. Whereas the new rule actually provides a lot more flexibility. So 3 criteria really. A driver is allowed to split that 10 hours in total of off-duty time as long as one of the short periods of rest is more than 2 hours. And the second longer period must be in the sleeper berth for at least 7 hours. So that enables the whole 8 or 2 split as well as the 7 and 3 split, as long as it actually adds up to 10 hours. And when both of these periods are satisfied, both of the periods are actually excluded from the 14-hour window. So 2 or more hours off duty, coupled with 7 or more hours in the sleeper berth, when you see those and they're both adding up to 10, they can actually be excluded from the 14 hours. So I think it's easier to demonstrate this with a couple of examples. So I have 2 for us to go over. The first example here is if a driver does 3 hours of off duty coupled with 7 hours in the sleeper berth. So, 10 hours in the sleeper berth. Now, this is a really interesting case. So a 10-hour rest actually qualifies as an actual restart, a reset to the 11 and 14 hours. But if you couple this actually with an off-duty then you can also benefit from having that 3 hours be excluded. Why? Because FMCSA actually made this the sleeper berth provision very flexible in the way it's defined in the new provision, where it says 2 periods must add to more than 10 hours. 1 period must be more than 2, which the 3 hours is, and the second period must be in the sleeper berth for more than 7. So in this case, it's 3 and 10, which clearly is over 10 hours, but also the 10 hours is in the sleeper berth, which is more than 7. So those 2 periods actually allow this 3 hours to be excluded from the 14-hour window. And so in this case here, if it was included, there would have been a violation. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 at 3 p.m. Whereas by excluding this, the driver is not in violation because he's just within the 14-hour window here. So that's a really good example of how the new rules provide added flexibility for the driver with the sleeper cab. Here's the second example, and this is a little bit more complicated. So to go over this in a little bit more detail, the driver takes 10 hours off before they start. And on day 1, what we can see here is the driver does a 2-hour off duty within 8 hours in the sleeper berth, which qualifies for the split because 1 period is more than 2 hours and the second period is more than 7 hours. And that adds up to 10. Now, how to calculate the split sleeper compliance within the new rules is once you see those 2 qualifying splits, taking one of the periods, you add before and after that qualifying period to see if there's 11 hours of driving time and also 14 hours of on-duty time, which is the window. So in this case, the driver actually has an 11-hour driving violation at 3 p.m. He's exceeded that 11 hours of total drive time. And then moving on to the next one, the 8 can pair with the 3 or the 2. But if we go with the pairing the 8 hours of sleeper berth with the 3, because you can actually roll. So you can go 2, 8, and 2 or more. So here in this case, the 8 actually can pair with that 3 that's gone from on day 2 from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. And when you pair the 8 with the 3, then you look at the period before the 8 and after the 8 before the 3. And when you add up all those times to look at the 11 hours of drive and within 14 hours of on duty, what we see is that there is no violation. So that means that that period actually is compliant. So if you, instead of pairing the 8 with the 3, what actually happens if we pair the 8 with the 2, which also makes sense because it meets the definitions for the new split sleeper berth, which is 2 periods that add up to 10, 1 period that's 7 or more, and 1 period that's 2 or more. So that also qualifies as well. Now, if we do that 8 and 2 pairing instead of the 8 and 3 pairing, let's see what happens if we pair the 8 with and with the 2 and calculate the period before the 8 with after the 8 that leads up to 2 hours of off duty. And if we do that, we notice that there's actually an 11-hour driving violation reached at 6 a.m. on day 2. And also it's a point where it's actually leading to a 14-hour violation as well. So if by adding up all this time, the driver actually reaches the 14-hour point at 6 a.m. And the reason for that is because this 3 hours here, that's an off duty, if we're not using it and we're pairing the 2 instead, then it does count towards the 14-hour window. And that is the reason why there's a 14-hour violation that will happen if we pair the 8 with the 2. And so because it's better for the driver, that does not lead to any violations by pairing the 8 and the 3. It's better for this driver in this case to pair 8 and the 3 instead of the 8 and the 2. Continuing on, for completeness with that sleeper berth example, on day 2, let's pair the 3 with the 7 hours of sleeper berth, because 2 and 7 do not add up to 10, so that 2 is not better than the 3. So let's go with the 3. 3 can pair with the 7 hours in the sleeper berth, and if we do, what we notice is that for that 3 hours, checking for compliance, we notice that there is actually an 11-hour driving violation at 4 p.m. So these are just actually more of the complicated scenarios that can actually happen within the new rule. So I'd encourage everybody just to take a look at these once you get the presentation. But also EROAD, we're actually conducting a training webinar just focusing on split sleeper berth and also the 30-minute rest break next week with enforcement doing the webinar as well. So Carrie Werkowski from CVSA is helping us to do that training webinar. So if you would like to participate and join to understand the split sleeper berth and 30-minute rest break rule a little bit more in detail, then please feel free to join that. We'll provide the way to register for that webinar after this. So with that, a few tips about implementation. So in terms of the compliance date, as mentioned earlier, the drivers and carriers must operate under the new rules as of September 29th, midnight in Eastern time. So for the drivers that are actually operating in different time zones, it actually means that this happens earlier for them. So for example, for a driver that's based out in the West Coast, that operates under the Pacific time zone, it means that the compliance date is actually for them on September 28th at 9 p.m. Pacific time, which equates to September 29th in Eastern Standard Time at midnight. So it's by time zones and different times, but the rules kick off on September 29th at midnight. So for those drivers that are asking when does it kick into effect, I think it's important to tell everybody that it is midnight on Eastern time zone, which actually means different times depending on where you are. In terms of what FMCSA have said, there are drivers and carriers that want to start operating under these new change rules earlier, but these rules do not take effect. And so if a driver wants to take advantage of some of these rules, then they may face violations if they start earlier. So it's important to note this date and time and make sure that any of the changes, if a carrier decides to implement them, are done on September 29th at midnight. So quick tips. It's as you can see with some of these changes, they can be very advantageous for the drivers and out there on the roads. And if you would like to take advantage of them, then it's important to make sure the drivers understand what these changes will be, as well as the back office staff and how they review and look at the driver's logs. So it's important to make sure that the training is done in advance and make sure that everybody knows what they need to do on the systems that they're using, as well as what the drivers have to mention if they are subject to roadside inspections. Second thing to note is there may be some updates to your company policies depending on whether you'd like to take advantage of some of these or not. If you do not want to take advantage of some of this and want to continue with how you're operating today, then you may need to keep the company policies outlining that even though those changes do take effect on September 29th, that the drivers are expected to operate under the company policy rules. So it's important to make sure that those are reflected. So maybe review and perhaps update what you have today. And finally, if you do have an ELD that your drivers or your back office staff are using, then it's important to understand how those providers are going to provide updates to those devices, and whether that is on a particular device that needs to be done on your end, or whether they will be updating over the air. And also, if there is an update, what time and what version should you be checking for? even on the back end, there should be some updates to make sure that any of the driver's logbook data that was captured prior to that take effect date needs to stay and remain under the old rules, and then also going forward, it needs to be processed by the new rule. So if there's an hours of service violations report, it needs to reflect the changes to those rules to make sure that they're picking it up correctly. So those are some of the things that you may want to think about and as part of your implementation strategy. And so turning over to the proposed split duties period pilot program. That's a really big mouthful there. So we saw on September 3rd that FMCSA's notice of proposed pilot program was published on that Federal Register. And what does that mean? FMCSA actually are seeking industry's comments on the pilot program's design by November 2nd, 2020. So by November 2nd, if you have any comments that you want to provide to this outlined pilot program, that's when you need to submit them by. Here is a link to actually get to that program. So the background to this, really briefly, is the split duty period proposal was actually outlined by OIDA, the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association, in a petition that was sent to FMCSA around the advanced notice of proposed rulemaking that led to inclusion as one of the proposals in the notice of proposed rulemaking. And so the idea with the split duty was allowing a driver to take 30 minutes up to 3 hours in off-duty status that was to pause the split, the 14-hour duty period. Unfortunately, looking at all the comments that were submitted around an NPRM, FMCSA decided to exclude it from the final rule after they were looking at all of the comments and the data that was provided, and found that it lacked any supportive safety and operational data for that particular proposal. So the purpose of this pilot program is that FMCSA still thinks that there is an advantage and a value and benefit to the drivers to provide flexibility whilst not impacting safety adversely. And so they actually want to gather statistically reliable evidence on whether this will impact or affect scheduling preferences for employers, shippers, and receivers on safety outcomes by doing this for the driver. So this is an exercise where they're actually studying what this particular proposal will do for drivers to see if this will be valuable and something that they want to implement as an actual rule. So the structure of this pilot program. So these are the key aspects that were outlined in the notice that you could take a look at as well, but this is a quick summary from my end. It's to study study for up to 3 hours with some of the drivers that actually are participating in this. So for any individual driver, they actually say that it may be limited to 6 months to a year, depending on the final design. What they're proposing is to give the participating drivers a temporary exemption from the 14-hour rule that says that the 14 hours do not exclude that any off-duty period. But for the drivers that are participating in the study, it will allow them to pause the 14-hour window by no less than 30 minutes and not more than 3. So between 30 and 3 hours, if they do take an off-duty time, it will pause that 14 hours. The study group is intended to include a range of CDL drivers from small, medium, and large carriers, as well as independent owner-operators. They're anticipating about 200 to 400 drivers to participate. And clearly, since this is actually a notice around this pilot program, the final program may be subject to changes based on any of the comments that are submitted. So if you do have any comments or feedback on this pilot program, then FMCSA are looking for those to be submitted by November. So to go over the pilot program in a little bit more detail, there are things that FMCSA are intending to collect to be able to study the impacts of this particular rule. So what are they going to look at? The data elements that they're looking at are the driver's rods. So to evaluate the duty hours, the driving hours, where they're taking the rest breaks, off-duty time, and the restart breaks. They're also intending to install an onboard monitoring system. It's video-based, and they're to evaluate the safety-related events, such as a driver's reaction time, whether they're fatigued, any lane deviations, and also the conditions that the driver is driving around, such as the traffic density and speed variability on the roads. They're also going to take a look at the roadside violation data from carriers, the drivers, and through SIDLIS. So any vehicle duty status, hazmat, and cargo-related violations will be reviewed for those drivers that are participating in this program. This is pretty interesting as well. FMCSA intends to provide wrist devices for the drivers participating to evaluate the sleep time and the time of day the sleep was taken, and also to see any intermittent wakefulness. So they're trying to see if there is a relationship between how a driver is taking their rest, as well as how they're impacted in terms of their on-duty times as well. So they're going to measure that through wrist devices that are out there, and I think they're going to supply that. So it's going to be interesting to have that additional data for this evaluation. And finally, drivers are expected to actually provide drivers written logs. And this is when they document when they're going to sleep, when they're waking up, as well as when they're taking that particular off-duty time between 30 minutes and 3 hours, when they're taking that pause and the reason for taking that pause, whether they were held up at a shipper or they were actually told to take a rest, or whether they were at a shipper and the load took too long to get ready. So what was the reason for taking that off-duty time is to be documented and reviewed. So there are two aspects to participating in this. Motor carriers have to be eligible, as well as the carriers, as well as the drivers themselves. And so what are the eligibility criteria for the carriers? They must have proper operating authority and registration, must have minimum levels of financial responsibility if applicable. They must not be a high or moderate risk carrier as defined by the Federal Register notice of ADD, and must not have a conditional or unsatisfactory safety rating, must not have had any enforcement action within the past 3 years, must not have a crash rate above national average, must not have a driver out of service rate above the national average, and also must not have a vehicle out of service rate above the national average. So a carrier that's in good standing will be able to qualify. If there are any feedback on this eligibility criteria, then this is an opportunity to provide comments. In addition to those criteria, the carriers must give permission for FMCSA to have video onboard systems installed, and also give permission for the drivers to participate in the program. And also there is a call out to assist in the recruitment of the study group drivers. So if a carrier is thinking about actually seeing the true impacts of this and want to have one of their drivers participate, these are the eligibility criteria that FMCSA are proposing as of now, and what permissions that they're looking for from each of those carriers that are intending to participate. So if this is too high of a threshold, then it's worth calling those out, as well as if this is too low as well. FMCSA are just looking for feedback in this area. In terms of the drivers, this is the criteria that's kind of proposed at the moment. Again, they're looking for feedback to see if this is good enough, or there are any feedback from the industry. So for the drivers, they must actually operate CMV as the main source of employment, must have a valid CDL, of course, maintain valid medical certificate from healthcare professional on the registry. They must have the employer's approval to participate in the study. And they must actually be a property carrying vehicle. So passenger carrying vehicles are out of scope for this, the purpose of this pilot. They must agree to release specific information to FMCSA. It's, I think, related to all of the particular data elements that we discussed earlier, and agree to the study procedures, such as use of the wristwatch, which they call actigraphs, and provide rods, and also have the video-based systems installed. Also for the drivers, in the 2 years preceding participation, they must not have had their driver's license suspended, revoked, or cancelled, or disqualified, and they must not have had any convictions for violations of state or local laws, except for, I think, parking violations, and they must not have had any traffic-related crashes. So a quick call out here for any owner-operators that want to participate. They would need to be leased out to a single carrier and obtain that carrier's approval in order to be eligible to participate. Now, this, I think, relates to a lot of the data collection and privacy concerns, as it relates to certain carriers as well, around rods, and also having those video-based systems installed. So I think they're also looking for feedback in this area, if this is too high of a threshold for drivers or not, and whether there should be any other factors that FMCSA should consider. So this is how you could go about submitting your comments. Go to the Federal Register's website and search for the document number here, which is FMCSA-2020-0098. It will lead you to this notice in detail. It's actually worth giving it a read. I just pulled out the summary parts for you to look at and also consider. But also, in terms of this process, it will go through a notice, which we have so far, and then the final study will be published at a later date once FMCSA has considered everybody's comments from the industry and safety agencies and groups. So this is actually a really good initiative again on FMCSA's part to not rule out that particular proposal, but to think about how they can actually look at data to help support our rulemaking. So I think it's really important to get any feedback in there, whether it's good or bad, but also whether you support this initiative or not. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions. Thank you again for listening to all the overview around the rules. I know it's actually got a lot of detail in there. So, Kelly.
That was wonderful, Soona. Thank you so much. We do have some questions, so let's just get to it.
Yeah.
Question 1. Will there be a transition period with the soft enforcement to help my drivers get used to the new rules?
That is a good question. As FMCSA has outlined so far, there's actually no soft enforcement period for these changes. They are looking to implement as on September 29th at midnight Eastern Standard Time. So if you do wish to try it out with your drivers, then I think it needs to be in a practice setting, and also in a classroom where you actually have to, make sure the drivers know what those rules are. And I think there are certain systems out there that enable you to try it out, but also it will not kick into effect, formally on your driver's records until September 29th.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Question 2. What should I be asking my ELD provider to ensure they are going to be ready on September 29th for the switch? Do they have to make these changes, to hours of service counters for me to be compliant?
So that's a great question. In terms of the ELD providers, it depends on how they will do this. So I think the question is, how will those updates be ready for my drivers and when, so that you can make sure that you will have it on all of your devices ahead of time. One way the ELD providers can tell you is that it is going to be ready over the air, and if so, by when will that version be available, and when will it take effect on those devices? For example, EROAD, we're preparing to provide the updates in the coming weeks, and the software itself will kick into effect on September 29th at midnight, and so the drivers will see those changes and be alerted of that on the device by that time. Now, in terms of the back office as well, those changes should be already in place, or should intend to be in place by September 29th, so that the data can be processed correctly by that time. And so I think it's worth asking and communicating with each of your ELD providers to make sure how to install it, if you do need to do that on your own, or whether it will be over the air, and which version number and when.
Okay, thank you. We have question 3, Rich, which is the last question I see. So if there's someone that still has a question, please submit that to Brittany Wooten through the chat portal. Question number 3, do these rules apply to intra-state drivers as well? INTRA.
Yeah, so intrastate rules will take effect once the state adopts their own administrative or legislative processes. As far as these changes go, it only impacts the interstate so far, and it is worth checking with each of the states that have the intrastate rules to see if those will be changed due to these rules. So again, just to reiterate, these changes are for the interstate drivers, and for each of the intrastate rule sets, it will be up to the state to see if they will need to modify or change those parameters due to these interstate rules. And if so, it will need to go through its own administrative or legislative processes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. We have no more questions at this time, so just a couple of quick reminders. The next online session through the IMTA FMCSA online educational system is September the 25th. It will again be at 9:30. It is Scopelitis, covering frivolous lawsuits and how to defend them. And there will be an update regarding what plaintiff attorneys are doing these days to work and get maximum settlement dollars. So something you definitely want to register for. As always, our online sessions are free to our members. So make sure you go online and register for that. October 17th and October 14th at the Indiana State Police Commercial Vehicle Enforcement Division offices in Ameriplex, we are going to be holding our annual DOT compliance and trucking seminars in person. But to do that and to do that safely and with social distancing, we are limiting, as of now, that classroom size to 26 attendees. That gives us the separation that we need to be compliant with our current mandates from Governor Holcomb. So right now there is an early bird registration on the website for members to register. I encourage you to go out to intrucking.org, click on events listing, look at those 2 sessions and all the other webinars and scale visits we have coming up. As I mentioned earlier, next week is the Seymour scale visit. We are also limiting those sessions to 20 attendees maximum with a mask requirement, of course. If you are an Indiana Motor Truck Association company member employee, and you're also an individual safety and maintenance council member, then you can register for scale visits at no cost. If you aren't a Safety and Maintenance Council member, and individual membership for the Safety and Maintenance Council, folks, is just $55 a person, that gives you 12 months from the time you join to attend any SMC scale visit or our meetings once we get back to meeting in person again. You would be able to attend those at no cost. But if you want to attend a scale visit right now and you are not an individual SMC member, it's $25 per person per scale visit. We will be wrapping up our scale visits at the end of September, so check out those dates and see if there's one scheduled still to be near you. With that, I just want to take a moment to comment and remember what today is 19 years ago. Take a moment today and remember those that we lost, and remember those that have fought for us since, and to defend our country and to defend our freedom. And Soona, thank you for being here today, and Brittany for your help. Everyone have a wonderful weekend. Take care.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, everybody.